Good evening, everybody. It's wonderful to see you all. I hope you've had at least a quick look at the exhibition upstairs. My name's Anthony Bale. I'm Professor of Medieval Studies at Birkbeck, and I was involved with my colleague David Feldman in collaborating with the Jewish Museum and with Abigail and Joe Rosenthal, who's somewhere around, who curated the exhibition, on putting this together. Both the exhibition and the academic events and this beautiful book which goes with it. It's a great pleasure to see you all here tonight in this kind of balmy surroundings. And it's an extremely great pleasure to be able to introduce our speaker tonight, Professor Jonathan Boyarin from Cornell University, who's joined us all the way from upstate New York. Professor Boyarin is the Mann Professor of Modern Jewish Studies and Professor of Anthropology at Cornell. And his work has been very wide-ranging, but has tended to be about Jewish communities and Jewish identity, and the kind of interweaving of identity, memory, language, culture, and religion in Jewish culture, and in particular in Yiddish culture. He's published very widely. The book which I think is most important to me is this wonderful book from about 5 or 6 years ago, The Unconverted Self, which was about the continuities between medieval Christian ideas of Jews and New World ideas about the Indians that they discovered there. It's a really wonderful, provocative book. It's really great that he's able to join us tonight and share some of his thoughts about issues which dovetail with those that we've tried to raise and contend with in the exhibition. So I'll hand you over to our speaker tonight. Please give a warm welcome to Professor Jonathan Boyarin, who's talking about genealogies of the future.
I want to thank very warmly Anthony Bale and David Feldman and the Institute and the Museum for this invitation. And I want to ask you, as you're listening and as we discuss after the talk, to help me with an immigration problem. Coming in just a few days ago through Heathrow to passport control, the immigration officer asked why we were coming, and I said I was giving a talk, and she said, well, what are you talking about? And I said, I came up with something, but I realized I really didn't have, an elevator speech for this one. Genealogies of the future just sounded too mystifying. She might not let me in just because it sounded too weird, and then to go through this whole talk. So perhaps by the time we all get up, I will have my elevator speech ready, and I will be grateful to you. The study of kinship is a mainstay of what is called here in Britain social anthropology. It is almost as central to what we in the United States have been calling cultural anthropology since the days of Franz Boas. That study may seem somewhat out of fashion now. It is linked, after all, to the period of high imperialism and colonialism, when anthropology on both sides of the Atlantic was understood to be primarily the study of peoples then called primitive, with more or less derogatory intent or affect. By the time anthropologists began turning their attention toward their own societies, and often their own peoples, the notion of attempting to establish a group's kinship structure as a central concern of ethnography had become somewhat passé. Nevertheless, as anthropologists also know, kinship in its protean forms remains a dynamic and shaping aspect of the realms of power, authority, prejudice, and solidarity that we shape as they shape in turn all of our lives. My colleague at Cornell University, Lucinda Ramberg, sees kinship at work in an unlikely place among the Jogati, Indian devotees of the goddess Yelama, who provide sex as part of their temple service. She, along with other anthropologists, reminds us that what we properly call kinship is not simply a matter of biological generation, but a complex symbolic system. She argues for a very inclusive notion of what she calls kin-making, pointing to these female Jogatis' assertions that they are, in the words of her book's title, given to the goddess. Ramberg writes that as a technology, kin-making is innovative. To think of kin-making as a technology of human generation and transformation is to get beyond the distinction between real and fictive kin and out of a field conscripted by blood and alliance. It might seem, she goes on, that we long ago left this field, but to the extent that the genealogical grid continues to delimit our categories of gendered personhood and relatedness, we have not. Now, the things I'll talk about this evening, unlike Ramberg's fascinating ethnography, will remain, for the most part, within the realm of what she calls here blood. Blood, in our common culture, is a common enough metaphor for biological descent, but not a particularly Jewish one. And Jewish kinship remains very much about alliance, that is, about the strategies of matchmaking that parents and extended families engage in for the purpose of their larger projects, their individual and shared projections of the future, their innovative making of time with the tools of kinship. Though I confess to being an anthropologist myself, my examples tonight will largely be drawn from literature and art, with ethnography making the odd guest appearance. My primary text, the one with which we'll begin and to which we will return, is a very short story by our late friend, Grace Paley. It is titled, At That Time, or The History of a Joke, and it was published in Grace's 1985 volume later the same day. Upon recently rereading it, I was astonished at how much this story seems to capture about potentially distinctive ways that Jews shape time through their practices of kinship and gender. And so I sent it to my very clever son, Jonah, but he was puzzled. What was he to make of it? I hope to provide some clues this evening. I can't guarantee that at the end of my talk, you will find the story as insightful as I do, but I hope it will help frame a set of references and questions, all of which circle somehow around these distinctive modes of Jewish time and kinship. Again, the story is At That Time, or The History of a Joke. At that time, most people were willing to donate organs. Abuses were expected. In fact, there was a young woman whose uterus was hysterically ripped from her by a passing gynecologist. He was distracted, he said, by the suffering of a childless couple in Fresh Meadows. The young woman said, "It wasn't the pain or the embarrassment, but I think any court would certainly award me the earliest uterine transplant that Dr. Heiliger can obtain. We are not a heartless people, and this was done at the lowest judicial level. No need to appeal to state or federal power." According to the Times, one of the young woman's ovaries rejected the new uterus. The other was perfectly satisfied and did not. "I feel fine," she said, but almost immediately began to swell, for in the soft red warm interior of her womb there was already a darling rolled up fetus. It was unfurled in due time, and lo, it was as black as the night which rests our day-worn eyes. "Then sing," said Heiliger the scientist, "for see how the myth of man advances on the back of technological achievement, and behold, without conceiving, a virgin has borne a son." This astonishing and holy news was carried to the eye of field, forest, and industrial park, wherever the media had thrust its wireless thumb. The people celebrated and were relatively joyful, and the birth was reenacted on giant screens in theaters and on small screens at home. Only on the underside of several cities, certain Jews who had observed and suffered the consequence of other virgin births cried out, weeping as usual, "It is not he! It is not he!" No one knew how to deal with them. They were stubborn and maintained a humorless determination. The authorities took away their shortwave and antennae, their stereo screen TV, and their temple videotapes. Soon this foolish remnant had nothing left. They had to visit one another or wander from town to town in order to say the most ordinary thing to a friend or relative. They had only their shawls and phylacteries, which were used by women too, for women by that time had made their great natural advances and were ministers, seers, rabbis, yogis, priests, etc., in well-known as well as esoteric religions. In their gossipy communications, they whispered the hidden or omitted fact, which some folks had already noticed. The child was a girl. And since word of mouth is sound made in the echo of God, in the beginning there was the Word, and it was without form but wide. Ear to mouth and mouth to ear, it soon became the people's knowledge, outwitting the computerized devices to which most sensible people had not said a private word for decades anyway. Then, okay, said Dr. Heiliger, it's perfectly true, but I didn't want to make waves in any water as viscous as the seas of mythology. Yes, it is a girl, a virgin, born of a virgin. Throughout the world, people smiled. By that time, sexism and racism had no public life, though they were still sometimes practiced by adults at home. They were as gladdened by one birth as another, and plans were made to symbolically sow the generations of the daughters one to another by using the holy infant's umbilicus. This was luckily flesh and symbol. Therefore, beside the cross to which people were accustomed, there hung the circle of the navel and the wiggly line of the umbilical cord. But those particular discontented Jews said again, wonderful! So, another tendency heard from. So it's a girl. Praise to the Most Highest. But the fact is, we need another virgin birth like our blessed dead want cupping by ancient holistic practitioners. And so they continued as female and male, descending and undescending, workers in the muddy basement of history, to which, this very day, the poor return when requiring a cheap but stunning garment for a wedding, birth, or funeral. Now, the story surely alludes to the continuing controversy surrounding the birth of one Jesus of Nazareth. And I notice there's a very similar scene in the exhibition upstairs. Just over 2,000 years ago, but the story is primarily about an imaginary baby born in the future. At least since the ministry of Jesus' contemporary Paul of Tarsus, what we now call in retrospect Judaism, has been linked to the dominant discourse of the West to the now outmoded past, while what we have come to call Christianity is understood as oriented toward the future. As argued, among others, by my brother Daniel in his book A Radical Jew, Paul and the Politics of Identity, Paul's rejection of marriage and procreation was part and parcel of his expectation that the end times were imminent. Paul, that is, rejected genealogical identification in favor of individual freedom and future orientation. This rejection of the past and concomitant stress on a liberating novelty is dramatized in his writings as where he declares that, for the sake of the Redeemer, I have accepted the loss of all things, and I consider them so much rubbish, that I may gain Christ and be found in him. Just one thing, forgetting what lies behind, but straining forward to what lies ahead. I continue my pursuit toward the goal, the prize of God's upward calling in Christ Jesus. As Paul makes clear in the same text, the things he now considers rubbish are the ancestral Jewish law and the Jewish law of ancestry. Paul thus signals a set of concerns focused around problems of genealogical and legal identity formation, which have found expression over the course of centuries in the dialectic of Jewishness and Christianity. It is important to insist that these tensions remain with us. Indeed, abstract and lofty notions as seemingly distant from family life or even family trees as the philosophy of history are inseparable from the problems of personal identity through time. Hence, of connections to ancestors and to some expected future outcome, whether for oneself or one's dependents. Thus, when, for example, the German Jewish philosopher Karl Löwith writes that history has time and again to be recovered and rediscovered by the living generations, the word generation needs to be understood not only as contemporaries, but also in a more literal sense than he seems to have intended. That is, children have to rediscover history, and their children's children will have to do the same. Moreover, this tension between past orientation and future orientation, which I've suggested has been understood to help structure the tense dialogue between Jewishness and Christianity in the West, found expression in 20th century debates about the best way to organize revolutionary forces. In the 12th of Walter Benjamin's near-canonic Theses on the Philosophy of History, written on the eve of World War II and near the end of his all-too-short life, he writes that revolutionary passions are really fueled more by the image of enslaved ancestors rather than that of liberated grandchildren. To me, as a young graduate student trying to recuperate a sense of East European Jewish life while also willing myself a political radical, the enslaved ancestors part, the call of memory, resonated as Jewish, while the future-oriented promise of liberated descendants sounded vaguely Christian. Of course, Jewish families and broader kinship networks are not only oriented toward the past, nor, for that matter, have the lives of most actual Christians been characterized by freedom from kinship ties or even the desire for such freedom. Still, given the common association of Jewishness with the past, one might have expected more work by anthropologists on Jewish kinship patterns. This genealogical chart, for example, from a 1984 article by Rhonda Berger-Sofer, dramatically shows the potentially rich field for social anthropology of Hasidic elites. And this is the Schneerson family kinship chart. But this chart, as fascinating as it is, and of course we could spend an hour, many hours talking about it, which I'm not prepared to do tonight. This chart itself is not distinctively Jewish. Rather, it is a product of the culture of social anthropology, in this case using Jews as its material. Kinship studies, until now, have indeed been past-oriented, largely because they depend on patterns derived from data already established, more than on imaginations or projections of the future. There is now some research into the workings of what I'm trying to name this evening as Jewish genealogies of the future. And in the culture of liberal United States Jewry, we perhaps find something more like Ramberg's idea of kinship divorced from biological genealogy or marriage alliances per se. In a fascinating recent dissertation on institutions in the contemporary United States that work to further the transmission of the Yiddish language and culture, Joshua Friedman articulates a useful notion that he calls abstract kinship. Abstract kinship involves a diffuse sense of intergenerational relation, in which notions especially of grandparenthood and, if you'll permit me, grandchildhood implicitly underlie the connections made between elderly donors and youthful students of Yiddish language and culture. The Yiddish Book Center in Massachusetts, where Friedman did his fieldwork, calls Yiddish language and culture Yerusha, a term whose base meaning conveys material inheritance, as of money or property, but which has long been rhetorically stretched to include symbolic resources. Unlike money or property, these symbolic resources dissipate if there is no descendant to act as an heir. The college-age and young adult interns Friedman interviewed at the Book Center are smart and reflective. They are well aware that in return for a summer in New England and some entree into the world of Yiddish, they are being recruited into the role of abstract heirs. And not always abstract, since the program includes carefully staged opportunities for major donors to meet with the interns. Sometimes, specific cross-generational relationships combine with the prospect of wealth transfer and the creation of new family bonds. Friedman records the conversation as students prepared for one such meeting. "Do you think if I become my donor's best friend, she'll fund my trip to Vilnius?" asked Mary, who had coincidentally met her donor earlier that summer on the latter's visit to the book center. "Seriously, though," she only half-seriously insisted, "that woman loved me." "I'm going to get set up with someone's granddaughter," Brian said, to the laughter and a few eye rolls of those around him. One of the interns, whom Friedman calls Evan, even compared himself to one of the Yiddish books that are on display for visitors to the center, suggesting that the center collects young Jews like it collects old Jewish books. The interns, even more than the Yiddish books at the center, thus serve as abstract heirs to donors who love this language and culture, but, except in rare cases, have not managed to pass it on to their own children and grandchildren. Of course, as Friedman also explains, this attempt to secure the future through kin-making doesn't always work. He writes, "In the case of students like Evan, a college freshman still in the process of determining the objects of his devotion, he may very well refuse this call. He might, in other words, turn out much less Yiddish than the book to which he compares himself. But where Evan may opt out, another student potentially opts in and enacts the desirable future of possible Yiddish and indeed Jewish returns." Now, Friedman was writing a dissertation in anthropology, so of course he has to throw in some references to classic theory. And therefore, citing Pierre Bourdieu's critique of Claude Lévi-Strauss, Friedman notes that even when intergenerational relationships may lend themselves to structural analysis, they remain contingent in practice. That is, they don't always work out. Of course, the chances that an individual who is designated as an heir or marriage partner will reject her assigned role in the kinship structure may be and seem greater when that person is a free-thinking student at an American university than when she is the daughter of a Hasidic Rebbe. And thus the prospect of slippage, the uncertainty about reciprocation that means the supposed structure may at any moment potentially be violated, may seem both slimmer and potentially more dramatic in the traditional case than in the modern one. But the principle remains the same. Kinship as a project, an attempt to throw ourselves and our identities forward, is always plagued by the uncertainty of that which only the future will tell. So kinship is a strategy to mold the future, but the future cannot guarantee success. Maybe this very uncertainty, the notion that we might be betrayed by the future, propels research in genealogy once again back into the past. Here, we are certainly on unstable ground, where it is not clear whether our projections are based on our values or whether what we claim and articulate as our values are based primarily on our anxieties about the future. As Susan Buck Morse has similarly asked, in the context of debates about the effects of Muslim presence in contemporary Europe, does such a thing as Europe exist that is threatened by the future? Or is the future a threat to the concept Europe itself? I suggest that if we're honest with ourselves, we actually know that our values and our anxieties shape each other. And one of the most promising forms of response to this knowledge is a consciously artistic invocation of kinship, explicitly understood as a message to the future. That is the kind of work the Chilean-Canadian Raphael Goldchain, a grandchild of emigres from Poland, performed in his series of self-portraits as, the word as is very important here, various relatives, maternal and paternal, male and female, known and unknown, and sometimes altogether imagined. In the series, oh, they're wonderful. There's a book, and you can go online, just Google Raphael Goldchain, you'll see all of them, and I'm just showing you a few. In the series' web presence, prior to its eventual publication, as an album titled I Am My Family, Goldchain writes, On Familial Ground is an autobiographical installation work that includes digitally altered self-portrait photographs, reproductions of pages from an artist's book, videotapes, and oral works. It is about grounding identity within a familial and cultural history subject to erasures. The self-portraits in On Familial Ground are detailed reenactments of ancestral figures and can be understood as acts of naming linked to mourning and remembrance. They propose a form of intersubjective connection between us and those we mourn. They suggest that we look at family photographs in order to know ourselves through the photographic trace left by the lost ancestral other. And they remind us of the unavoidable and necessary work of inheritance. He continues, Familial Ground is the product of a process that started several years ago when my son was born. I gradually realized that my new role as parent included the responsibility to pass on to my son a familial and cultural inheritance, and that such inheritance would need to be gathered and delivered gradually in a manner appropriate to his age. My attempts at articulating histories, cultural and familial, public and private, made me acutely aware of how much I knew of the former and how little of the latter. These images are the result of a reconstructive process that acknowledges its own limitations, in that the construction of an image of the past unavoidably involves a mixture of fragmented memory, artifice, and invention, and that this mixture necessarily evolves as it is transmitted from generation to generation. Goldchain's work offers something like hope, a word that I usually regard with suspicion. I regard hope as a name for a drug that offers illusion at least as often as genuine inspiration, especially when we are most insistent that we must not lose hope. What warms me in Goldchain's statement is the forthright acknowledgement that artifice, and not merely dogged research, is necessary if he is to shape a record of ancestry that he can transmit to his son. To use Lucinda Ramberg's words again, Goldchain's art is a work of kin-making as an innovative technology, oriented both toward the past and toward the future. In fact, not only the future, but also the past, to a great extent, is not known, but must be imagined. Nevertheless, this artistic work of recuperation is not easy. It is not only difficult, it is precisely uneasy. Note one moment of slippage in Goldchain's otherwise very lucid text. I repeat, he asserts that his images, here's the quote, suggest that we look at family photographs in order to know ourselves through the photographic trace left by the lost ancestral other. That's the end of the quote. But his are not family photographs. They are self-portraits, sometimes and not always inspired by documentary photographs that he has gathered. His own work is inescapably a work of self-knowledge. Here, however, he skirts the risk of authorizing his audience to more simply and uncritically look at their own collections of ancestral images and think that thereby we know ourselves. Does this perhaps in turn betray some anxiety about the balance Goldchain had to constantly maintain between recuperation and illusion? We may, I think, fairly call this a distinctively, if not uniquely, Jewish anxiety about the relationship between kinship and time. The temptation to overcome anxiety about lost ancestry is betrayed in current fascination with the supposed ability of DNA analysis to tell you, as anthropologist Nadia Abu El-Hajj's interviewees put it, who you really are. Through new technologies of kinship, such as the study of the genome, the past can be not only recuperated, but become even more fixed than it was before. The rhetoric used in this search is sometimes most flamboyant. Thus, for example, DNA is at once an atlas and a time machine that can transport us to biblical times and beyond, awakening us to the shared roots of civilization and the promise of designer therapies to target disease. We carry pinpoints of DNA that suggest that maybe human population groups aren't really quite so alike. However slight our genetic differences may be, they are defining, and they mark me indelibly as a Jew. I didn't write that. Thus wrote a man named David Entine, a male carrier of the BRCA gene that is tied to greatly increased risk of breast cancer. Father of a daughter whose mother is identified as Christian, writing in the March-April 2008 issue of Ancestry magazine. The anthropologist Kaya Finkler eloquently summed up the temptations of this idea that DNA testing tells us once and for all who we really are, as she writes, knowledge of shared DNA may substitute for our fragile memories and may transcend memories of ancestors recorded in faded photographs and other artifacts, or embedded in the consciousness of sounds, smells, affects, and tales, and leaves little to mystery in the absence of experience and feelings. American Jews, largely of Ashkenazi descent, are among the most avid consumers of the new technologies promising to tell you where you come from and who you're related to through DNA testing. They are not the only ones, and the similar popularity of such tests among African Americans might suggest something about the relation between traumatic breaks in generational continuity and the desire for a technology to restore a semblance of the past. I suggest, however, that there are several good reasons, none having to do with any putative neurotic tendencies, why Jews may have been and may remain particularly anxious about the future of kinship. First, for millennia, and almost certainly for most of the time they have been called and have thought of themselves as Jews, they have lived not in a land they and others call their own, but in diaspora. Diaspora, as a technology of identity, depends in turn more on the maintenance of kin boundaries than do collective identities grounded in shared territory. Second, and it doesn't take a professor to tell you this, is the still recent experience of genocide. The first line of Yiddish writer Chaim Grade's volume of poetry with the affirmative title, Yo, published shortly after the catastrophe, begins with the demand, Yiddische Mames, hot Kinder. That is, Jewish mothers have children. And while it is possible, I suppose, to bear children without kinship, surely the plea here was not only a demographic one, but expressed a fervent desire to have the skein of genealogy stretching forward and backward renewed. In a sense, Grada was referring to the same dilemma that the poet Moshe Schulstein addressed in the late 1940s when he wrote, "Es werden nicht fehlen die Nemen noch Wemmen." There will be no lack of the ancestors to name our children after. Third, whether or not anti-Semitism is somehow endemic to the West, there have certainly been threats to the autonomous responsibility of Jewish parents for the fate of their progeny on many occasions, long predating the disaster of the 20th century. Just one remarkable example is Canon 60 of the Fourth Council of Toledo in the year 633, which mandated the removal of children of forcibly baptized Jews from their parents in order that they may be raised by devout Christians. As the scholar Lindsay Kaplan explains, in the 13th century, the French Dominican William of Rennes argued that Jews were legally slaves of the princes. And just as these princes are able against their parents' wishes to give to others or to sell into servitude the same little children, like his own slaves, so they can offer them to baptism. However common this actual forced removal combined with baptism may or may not have been, William of Rennes' rhetoric here links the detachment of the child from Jewish kinship networks to a notion of baptism as the alternative to slavery. The analogy to 20th century coming-of-age narratives of Jewish children breaking away from the confines of their supposedly stifling family background is chilling in this light. Fourth, in pre-modern Christian doctrine, the Jews were mostly supposed to wither away anyway. True, Augustine argued for the persistence of a degraded remnant, arguing against the idea that there is no place in Christendom for Jews after the revelation of the messiahship of Jesus and their stubborn refusal to acknowledge that messiahship. This is, of course, part of what is known as the doctrine of supersession, the idea that Judaism, whatever the status of that term, is now obsolete. Hence, also, the trope of the old Jew that persists through European Christian folklore. Fifth, and last in this list for now, the perceived prospects of future Jewish generations are oddly skewed toward the negative for perhaps many reasons, but one that I identify here. Those sectors of the contemporary Jewish population that have the strongest and most strictly regulated kinship bonds, I'm speaking of the Hasidim and other Haredi groups, are frequently perceived as belonging to the past. One contributor to a 1994 volume on the Jewish family and Jewish continuity wrote of the Hasidim as, use this word, a dynamic group, but nevertheless dismissed them as remaining in the 19th century. Not sure why he chose the 19th. As I pointed out recently in my book on Jewish families, that doesn't make sense. Everyone you or I might talk to today, which fortunately includes Hasidim, is living at the same time as you or I. Actually, the notion that communities persisting in strictly regulated and gendered kinship patterns are inherently stuck in the past is only one horn of the dilemma of Jewish continuity. The other horn is its mirror, the sense prevalent in some Jewish communities for centuries now that Jews can only get ahead, that is, join the march towards some presumptive better future for all, by escaping the bonds of in-group marriage and identity. Such a sense, it needs to be said gently, harmonizes well with the millennial Christian view that Jewish particularism needs to be overcome if all, and not only the Jews, are to be redeemed. It's worth pointing out here that while I've been emphasizing the pulls of both the past and the future on kinship, the desires that technologies of kin-making are designed to express may also be desires for stasis, or more prosaically, maintenance of the status quo. When representatives of Jewish community organizations speak about the imperative of continuity, might this not sometimes betray a covert wish that things remain as they are rather than continue to be transformed? To be fair, the rhetoric of Jewish continuity in the organized Jewish community recognizes that change is necessary. But perhaps far too often, that change itself is understood as learning how to make Jewishness fit what a new generation already understood as having escaped the constraints of Jewish kinship might respond to. In that respect, Jewish continuity is not so much about past, present, or future as about a perpetual attempt to catch up, often with nothing more substantial than passing fashion as dictated by the marketplace. Early in this talk, I invoked my intellectual hero, Walter Benjamin, and his dictum pointing to enslaved ancestors rather than liberated grandchildren as the sources of revolutionary zeal. Unfortunately, I think it's unfortunate, in his own writings, he had little to say about the specifics of his own ancestry. In his memoir, A Berlin Childhood around 1900, he recalls one elderly aunt living in an already obsolete quarter of the city, He passes on few details of what she told him about his ancestors, beyond the very suggestive observation that their recently acquired last names were often toponyms, the names of small towns and hamlets in the countryside, and hence smacked more of the memory of place than the memory of family. But he does also give us enough to suggest a narrative trajectory from the past intended to guide the neophyte toward a future anticipated by his ancestors, as he writes. Such stories, the stories that his elderly aunt told him, that is, brought to light what little I knew of my forebears. The career of an ancestor, a grandfather's rules of conduct, were conjured up before me as though to make me understand that it was premature for me to give away by an early death the splendid trump cards which I held in my hand, thanks to my origins. Now, nothing is said in Benjamin's memoir about the Jewishness of those forebears, and in fact, one gets the impression that what was distinctive about them was their origin in the countryside as opposed to the city. After all, Benjamin's emphasis in that memoir is his Berlin childhood, not his Jewish childhood. When he recalls a childhood ritual of springtime, it is an Easter egg hunt rather than the search for chametz. Our patience is short, shorter perhaps than that of our ancestors, if a bit longer than that of our children. Soon it will be time to read Grace Paley's story again, this time trying to shed more light on some of its possible meanings than we were able to perceive on first hearing. Before we do that, let me linger a bit with one more text, hundreds of times longer than Paley's sketch. I refer to Aleph Bet Yehoshua's novel Mr. Mani, published in English in 1992. The novel comprises 5 parts, each told as one side of a dialogue between a younger person and a parent or other parent figure. Each part figures a different Mr. Mani, another in a direct line of Sephardi males, and each part focuses on the upbringing of the one who is to become the next Mr. Mani. So that's earliest in time to last in time. They are told, however, in reverse chronological order, that is, each successive part set in a time and describing a generation earlier than the one that precedes it. Rather than back to the future, this narrative moves forward to the past. Right? So this is part 1, and by part 5, we're up here. The first section, set in Jerusalem at the time of the novel's writing, describes an encounter between, on one hand, a young woman with a provocative name, Hagar, who believes herself pregnant, and on the other, the father of her boyfriend. That father seems in suicidal despair over the recent death of his own wife, while the young woman's intervention, at least as she perceives it, prevents that suicide. Thus, in a sense, Hagar takes the place of her boyfriend's father's deceased wife. We skip forward in pages and back in time to the 5th and final section of Yehoshua's novel, set in Athens in 1848. Another Mr. Mani visits, consoles, and confronts his revered rabbi from childhood. That revered rabbi, by now quite aged and utterly incapacitated following a stroke, had belatedly married the Doña Flora, whom Mr. Mani desired in his own youth. The rabbi's marriage to Doña Flora has borne no fruit. Meanwhile, Doña Flora's niece has married Mr. Mani's son, and the couple are now living in Jerusalem. In the course of this Mr. Mani's one-sided conversation with Doña Flora, and then only with his stricken rabbi, he reveals the secret that his supposed grandson, recently born in Jerusalem and presumed the child of his recently deceased son, again we're in these generations, this supposed grandson is actually Mr. Mani's own son, conceived during the year of mourning for the Mani who was his son. The question he desperately and, it seems, tauntingly and vengefully seeks an answer for from his mute rabbi is this: will he, by his own suicide, be able to expiate the grave sin of incest that he has committed in getting his son's widow with child? We are told in a biographical supplement that having received no answer from his rabbi, Avraham Mani did not commit suicide. Are we readers then to understand that suicide as being deferred from generation to generation of the Mani family, down to the near suicide that our Hagar of the narrative's first but most recent part thinks she has interrupted? Maybe that's a good reading. Even Hagar, in the course of her relation to her telling to her own widowed kibbutznik mother, has confessed that she felt like she was part of some much larger tale. I feel like it was a movie or something, Mom. I had this weird feeling like I was in a novel. It's almost hokey, but not quite. It would, of course, not be the first time in the history of Jewish literature that the arc of the collective's future is foretold in terms of a number of generations. Indeed, the Mishnah in Tractate Eduyos asserts that a son benefits his own father by helping to fulfill the number of generations that God has already declared will come before the end of the exile, as it is stated in Isaiah. Kore hadoros mirosh. He announced the generations beforehand. Thus, each new generation brings us one step closer to redemption. Though the allusion to Isaiah might tempt us to read Mr. Mani as a tale of redemption with the fulfillment of the male line, the book itself does not end on anything like a triumphant note. In any case, the multi-generational narrative's first but culminating episode seems to have brought us to some degree of healing. Possibly that healing has something to do with the fact that this new generation are all citizens of a Jewish state, unlike their ancestors whose distracted longings and fantasies had much to do with the lack of homeland. Hagar, the current-day narrator, becomes pregnant again, this time for real, and while her lover is abroad in graduate school, his widowed father comes from time to visit the kibbutz and get to know his own grandson. Perhaps the widowed father and Hagar's widowed mother will marry each other, perhaps not. It is not even clear that this tale of generations has been about an inherited curse, or about what its fiercely Zionist author, Aleph Bet Yehoshua, believes are the inherent pathologies of families in diaspora. Although having read some of his texts, I suspect that might have been what he had in mind. What is clear is that a family story can be told going backward as well as forward, and perhaps even more powerfully so. If Grace Paley's At That Time or the History of a Joke can be called a family story as well, it is only in the very broad sense that the Jews are a big family, or that all members of Homo sapiens constitute an even greater family of humankind. As I mentioned, our own son Jonah didn't immediately share my enthusiasm for the story. I suppose I thought he might, since, even more than I, he is sensitive to the continuing workings of what he calls white Christian privilege in our own United States. So these thoughts are sparked in part by my own disappointment at a failed attempt to connect with my own descendant, and they constitute in part the work of trying to recuperate that failure. Still, I'm not sure I can fully answer my son's perplexity, because like all great fiction, at that time surpasses any one individual's interpretation. Or perhaps Grace Paley herself was not quite sure what to make of this text. But here are a few signposts toward understanding this history of a joke that I hope our discussion will have made it easier to discern. The story was first published between the covers of a book in 1985, yet it includes a reference to a stolen uterus and then to a uterus transplant, which we now, in our own world and in our own time, hear of happening for the first time just last year in Sweden. So at that time the story's title refers to might just be our own day, more than 30 years in the future when the story was conceived. The doctor who commits this theft is referred to as hysterical, suggesting that not only those who actually possess a womb are subject to the diagnosis of hysteria. The passing gynecologist, I almost said genealogist, might not just have been hurrying by, but also pretending to pass as a Christian rather than a Jew. Certainly his name, Dr. Heiliger, or holy man, is ambiguous enough for him to pass as either. The reference to Fresh Meadows is harder to read, but I should tell this London audience that it names a neighborhood in Queens, New York. There's a series of transformations in the story, or perhaps better, conveyances that strike us as magical, whimsical, or both. The stolen uterus replaced by transplant, a virgin birth assumed to be of a boy child and announced as such, but actually a girl, a child unexpectedly born black, though why did we as readers assume that the young mother herself had white skin? A repetition of the birth of a savior rather than the annunciation of his return as Messiah, mature and ready to redeem, and then not a transformation, but a mythic repetition, not the Jews, tout court, but only certain of them, evidently 2,000 years old, because they had observed and suffered the consequences of other virgin births, crying yet again, "It is not he! It is not he!" As a result of their denial of this new advent, these certain Jews, this foolish remnant, as Paley also calls them, are cut off from electronic media, thus, in the world of the tale, from all contact with anyone except themselves, and must actually come face to face in order to maintain everyday contact. They are materially reduced to the most basic religious symbols, but not thrown into the past, for these symbols, shawls and phylacteries, are by now routinely worn by women as well. Moreover, this foolish remnant, like the naive child who declares that the emperor has no clothes, are the first to announce that the product of the virgin birth is a girl. Not a problem for most of the world of this story, since everyone else except the particular discontented Jews are ready to modify the old myth by adding the symbol of circular navel and wiggly umbilical cord. The Jews, let's just call them that after all, since particularity is characteristic of Jewishness in any case, are by now quite ready for a female divinity, offering their praise to the Most Highest. Yet they continue stubbornly, nostalgically, if you will, to refer to 20th century left-wing politics. I grew up with the phrase, another party heard from. Another tendency heard from is doubtless a variation on that. And they refer to pre-modern medical practices, doubtless quoting or thinking of their grandmother's Yiddish to insist that another virgin birth wird helfen via Teutenbankis. Do I need to translate that?
Yeah.
Bankis are the cups that were traditionally used, heating the air and then putting the cups on the skin to draw out the bad humors. So helfen via Teutenbankis is helping like cupping a dead person. Now, I grant that the identity of they in the final paragraph is a bit ambiguous. Did only the Jews here continue as female and male as the God of Genesis had created them, stubbornly denying the triumphal supersession of gender difference that Paul announces in his letter to the Galatians? The "if so" suggests that their persistence as gendered is a consequence of their rejection of the newborn's saving power. Certainly, they continue in their generations, in Paley's story, descending by continuing to conceive and bear in the old-fashioned way, and in the old-fashioned way as well, to stick it out in the schmata business. The muddy basement of history they continue to occupy suggests the bargain basements of New York City department stores in the mid to late 20th century, where the good finds were. And the poor Gentiles as well, it seems, continue to descend as well. Else, why would they need to be dressed for such life cycle rituals as weddings, births, or funerals? If one didn't know Grace Paley better, at least through her many writings, one might be forgiven for wondering what the author of this curious brief fantasy thinks about the particular discontented Jews. Are they stubbornly remaining behind, refusing universal redemption? After all, the world of this story is one where sexism and racism had no public life. That's real progress, no doubt. But shining through Grace Paley's stories is a fierce, tremendous, and unsentimental love for the skepticism, the stubborn difference of those particular Jews, and also of those poor people, many, but by no means all of them Jews, about whom she so often wrote. The Jews descend every day, but Saturday perhaps, to the muddy basement of history, finding the right clothes for those moments that make it possible, somehow, always tentatively, in ways that are transformed, whether we celebrate the transformations or attempt to deny them, to locate ourselves forward and backward in time through our practices of genealogy. Thank you very much.
Thank you for such a challenging and often provocative paper, and one which raised lots of the questions I think we were thinking about in putting the exhibition together, and this very ambiguous and troubling move from blood rituals to eugenics to genetics, and then back again, and where the exhibition kind of ends. But also this remarkably culturally productive, but very, very slippery and difficult question of identity and stubborn difference, as you called it. So we have a few minutes for questions. There is a microphone going around. Madison will bring the microphone around. So would anybody like to ask a question? Yes, at the back there.
Just wondered, what was your evidence for Jews in America being interested in DNA studies of their families? Because, I mean, when you look online, I've seen mostly these one name family DNA projects, and I haven't ever run into any Jewish ones.
Sorry,
could you repeat the question?
Yes, I will repeat the question. She asked what was my evidence for American Jews being particularly interested in the services that that purport to tell you about your family origins through analysis of your DNA. To some extent, I rely on the genealogical investments of my spouse, Dr. Alyssa Sampson here, who could talk more to it. But in terms of a printed reference, that issue is, to me, one of the most solid and fascinating parts of a book by my colleague Nadia Abu El-Hajj called The Genealogical Science, which is largely about the academic but also the popular discourse on Jewish genetics and Jewish history. And her ethnographic field was primarily with, I would say, well-educated Ashkenazi-descended 20 and 30-something Jewish people on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. And the quote, the quotes about now I know who I really am. That's also somewhere in Nadia's book, and I find that quite striking.
If I could just give a brief answer to that previous question. Family Tree DNA, which is probably the major company doing DNA testing, both wide and mtDNA and chromosomal DNA, has approximately 300,000 individual Jewish names so far tested, which I think is quite significant. Approximately 60% Ashkenazi and 40% are Sephardi. And there's some extremely surprising results. It's also been written up at a very high academic level by people like Carl Skoretti, Haifa, Doron Liebhauer, etc. And there will be a conference I think it's July next year on Jewish genetic genealogy.
Right, but the last part of your comment was really addressed to the scholarly scientific research more than the practice of finding out who you are at the popular level, so to speak.
So if I can add to this answer, I myself have done the 23andMe, is that what it's called?
Yes,
This,
23andMe.
There's very popular, cheap genetic thing. And if you put your details in, you start getting these emails from total strangers without the same name as anyone you've ever known saying, we're related. And it turns out they're related kind of, some distance back, but it's all about this kind of idea of intimacy through your genetics. And a shared intimacy, and setting up a digital genetic community through that, which is I think, a very different way of thinking about your identity.
I could also add to the answer that it's clear that this is, whatever is happening, this is not replacing the more traditional genealogical research through public records and so forth.
I just have to answer that because, like, my daughter goes online and has me answer these questions that prove I'm descended from a 15th century samurai.
Madam, they may well be.
There was a question somewhere over here.
I just wanted to add to that I just for kind of.
So wait for the microphone. Sorry.
I just wanted to add to that. I subscribe to one or two English or British genealogical email lists, and there's a great fascination with this, and not just among young people, but lots of them as well.
Any other questions? Yes, gentlemen.
In your talk, I found it a bit difficult, but in one aspect, I saw a parallel that you comment on, is that in the Renaissance, in the French Renaissance, is that there was a welcoming of Jews to the future as individuals and a rejection of the state within the state as the past. Is this effectively what you're saying, that the past is isolation, a state within a state, the future is individuals?
I did indeed range very, very widely in this talk. I think to some extent Antony's invitation provoked me to begin to try to synthesize in some very broad terms questions I've been working on various facets of for decades. So I appreciate your attention. And your question picks up very precisely on one absolutely crucial moment that I addressed in about 5 seconds of the talk, which is, first of all, you're referring to at the time of the French Revolution, the declaration to the Jews as individuals, everything to the Jews as a nation, nothing, which is a crucially important statement that I was suggesting does have a great deal to do with Jewish anxiety about the generations of the future, because the way European history has developed for the past millennium or so, the idea of an organized Jewish community is very closely tied to the idea of Jewish endogamy, that is, of Jews marrying only other Jews. And in the book Jewish Families, I cite not my own primary research, but from a secondary source, 19th century white Protestant sources saying, look, you Jews, if you want to become American, you're going to have to start marrying us. That is, in a sense, the opposite of racism. That is the dilemma of the Jewish community within an assimilative liberal society. Precisely, yes.
Question here.
Am I correct in saying that under Jewish law that there's a sense that descendants can actually purify the sins of ancestors? I'm thinking particularly of Mamzerim, the evil of pastor. branches it off for a few generations, Mamzerim can then marry anybody.
It's not just that. Well, no, it's not just after several generations. The question he addressed is the legal category of the mamzer, which loosely translates to bastard, although that's somewhat misleading. I am fascinated and didn't talk tonight about the Talmudic discussions in the 4th chapter of the tractate Kiddushin. Kiddushin means betrothals, so that is the Talmudic tractate about marriage strategies. And the 4th chapter is about different categories of different genealogical categories, several of which are considered tainted in one way or another. And even according to biblical law, this category of mamzer is a taint that is not eradicated no matter how many generations go down. So there are discussions, I'm not sure in the Talmud itself, but perhaps in later rabbinic law, about strategies such as marrying a slave woman and then liberating her so that she's now born again, as it were, so that the children are not your children and so forth. It's a famous pattern, famous problem in Jewish law, and it seems to be one that the Israeli rabbinate kind of dodges. Unlike certain other obscure problems, which is absolutely fascinating.
Thank you. When you mentioned endogamy, I wondered whether you wanted to make a comment on, given that Jews wanting to stick to themselves, it seems that with what Donald Trump has just said, many, not just him, but many Americans feel much the same.
Are you suggesting that Americans might
No, I just
want
wondered whether
to
you
stick
had
to
any
themselves? Me? He ain't gonna be my president. No.
But it seems that a huge number of people, this is what's so surprising, isn't it, feel, after the comments he made about people celebrating 9/11, the comments he made about people celebrating 9/11, what he said about the Mexicans, and what he's now said that
I think
nobody's safe in Paris or London, and yet 30% of huge numbers of people, of the electorate, it seems, according to the polls, are right behind him.
I cannot speak for the American populace as a whole. I do find Trump's run for the presidency and his rhetoric a very, very frightening symptom of a world where the kinds of projections for the future, the kinds of hopes for the future, to indulge in that word that I'm talking about in this talk seem, I won't say more tenuous than ever because we have lived through great crises, but much more tenuous than when I was younger, much more tenuous than I expected they would be as I was growing up. But the other comment that your question requires me to at least allude to, but not to try to solve, is what are the similarities and what are the differences between a group of people, particularly a minority group or a group in diaspora, struggling to or working to maintain itself through the boundaries of kinship, that is, maintaining itself in time by precisely these strategies of kin making, and the kinds of xenophobia that are called for or enacted on the part of powerful territorial nation states with armies and border police. And that is also question that has occupied me for decades. And I struggle to sustain the idea that there is an ethical difference between those two situations, without, on the other hand, insisting that the minorities or the diaspora groups are always powerless and hence essentially innocent.
Any other questions? Yeah. Last one here.
Would you, I don't know, you're a very learned man, I'm not a very learned man, but would you think, or would you believe that there seem to be more and more ways of identifying yourself as a Jew nowadays, and other people identifying you as a Jew nowadays, compared to what they were? Or am I just kind of silly and sentimental in thinking that everything was religious and orthodox and shtetl-based and so on in the past?
Well, yeah, I wouldn't say those nasty things about you, but I also would not myself say everything was religious and shtetl-based once upon a time, because I think the whole notion of the past as inherently more religious is problematic and involves a notion of what religion is that is more confusing than illuminating. The part of the first part of your question that I will address is to say that I think there's a fragmentation of ways of identifying and being identified. I thought I'm captivated by a metaphor of the Yiddish poet Peretz Markish that I think may be based on a comment by Rashi. Rashi, the great medieval commentator Rashi, spoke about the many meanings, including midrashic meanings, that can come from a single verse or word in Scripture as being compared to the many sparks that arise when a hammer is struck upon a rock. The Soviet Yiddish poet Peretz Markish wrote, "I feel broken wie a Spiegel auf a Stein, like a splinter shattered upon a rock." And I think that there are, especially with new electronic media, an almost infinite reflections of bits of what people now imagine to be authentic Jewishness. So that may be one way to describe the sense of loss that I think your question deduces.
I think we need to draw the questions to a close, I'm afraid. We're out of time. Thank you very much for fielding such wide-ranging questions. Before I release you, I just want to mention the book once again. This is not a kind of comfortable or easy subject, and the essays in the book do try to kind of explore some of these different destinations that we've heard in the talk tonight. But I also want to make a more light-hearted plug to the merchandise in the shop. It's not easy to stock merchandise for an exhibition like this, but there's wonderful syringe pens. So if you have any doctors in your family in particular, these will make an excellent. So thank you all very much for coming, and thank you to the museum for hosting this event, and we thank our speaker for a wonderful talk.